So hello, good afternoon.
Megan,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. If you want to start the recording as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Recording in progress.
Okay. So we are recording and we are live streaming to our YouTube channel. So if anybody missed this, or you know somebody that missed it, or you need to watch it later on, it will be available later on our YouTube channel. And I will put that link into the chat. So good afternoon. Hello, everybody. My name is Megan Vitale. I am Principal Transportation Planner with the Syracuse Metropolitan Transportation Council. We're the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Syracuse metropolitan area. I recognize a lot of the names today, so I think most of you are familiar with who we are. If you're not, I will put our website into the chat. Somehow, I guess you got our email or got it forwarded from somebody else, so I hope you'll check out our website and learn a little bit more about us. We hold these Forum on Active Transportation meetings about 4 times a year. We've been doing that for since March of 2021. So for this springtime meeting, we took this great opportunity to have Dan Sirachi from Urban Cycling Solutions, who is doing this Complete Streets workshop for New York State communities. So I'm going to turn it over to him here to run through the material. There's a lot to cover. Everybody is muted. You need to have, nobody can unmute themselves. We have to send you a request to unmute, and that's just to keep background noise down. But if you do have questions, please type them into the chat. If there's anything you need clarification on during the meeting, and our staff from SMTC will be monitoring that. And then when we get to the walk audit portion, kind of in the middle of the workshop, and then again during the Q&A, you can use the raise hand function if you need to ask a question, or again type into the chat, and we'll try to kind of summarize the questions and comments that are coming in, and ask Dan to answer those so we can be efficient with everybody's time. So that's my quick intro. Again, use the chat if you're having any issues, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thank you all for having me. Really excited to talk to you all about Complete Streets today and what that even means. Before we get into that, just a very brief overview of this program, if I can advance my slides. There we go. So as Megan said, my name is Dan Sirachi. I'm the president of Urban Cycling Solutions, and we're a small consulting company that's focused on active transportation, complete streets, and our particular specialty is bicycle integration with transit. This training was originally funded, the development of the curriculum was funded by NYSERDA, and the ongoing, this workshop's actually provided for free in New York State communities thanks to support from the New York State Department of Health. We've been doing these workshops since 2019, and I'm really thrilled to be able to offer it to you. That said, I personally have spent my entire career working on active mobility issues. You know, I've done a lot of master planning, I've done walk audits, lots and lots of these trainings. So this is the bread and butter of what we do. And, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions. Anything that we do not get to from the chat today, I am happy to answer in writing after the training. So please, please, please don't hesitate with the questions. That said, the training is going to flow as follows. First, we're going to talk broadly about what active transportation complete streets means. We're going to talk about what it looks like and how you create different designs with complete streets, what sort of design tools you have. We're going to talk about how you integrate different transportation systems, how you develop policy, how to effectively implement complete streets, and then finally talk about evaluating complete streets. So before we get into all that, I want to put out a disclaimer. I'm sure there's some of you on the call today who are, you know, you see I'm from Urban Cycling Solutions, and you've probably heard complete streets and, you know, have different conceptions of what that means. First and foremost, I am not here to tell you that you need to rip out all of your parking and put in bike lanes and, you know, reduce roadway volume. That's not what this is about. If we take a step back, today we're talking about our streets, which are public spaces, right? Our tax dollars fund the design, the build out, the operations and the maintenance of our streets. So they are public spaces just as any other park or recreation center would be. So as taxpayers, as people who live and work and play in a community, it's up to us to determine what the highest and best use of that public space actually is. And that's what we're here to do today. What I want to do is I want to help you figure out how to transform your streetscape or all of your streets into economic development catalysts, which you stimulate higher public health, social, and economic outcomes while ensuring optimal safety for all users, regardless of whether you're in a car, on a bike, on a bus, or just walking. There are a lot of tools to get there. There's a lot of tools to figure out what that, to make that highest and best use a reality. Bike lanes are one tool, curb bump outs are a tool, different crosswalk designs are tools, but maybe those aren't the right tools for your context. So again, as we go through this training, our goal here is to think about that highest and best use and to apply the right design solutions based on our goals. So keep that in the back of your head as we go through it. To kick things off, let's talk about some definitions here. So what is active transportation? According to the CDC, active transportation is any self-propelled human-powered mode of transportation, such as walking or bicycling. Now, this is a pretty straightforward definition, but what's interesting about it is where it comes from. This is coming from the CDC, not the US DOT or New York State DOT, but the Center for Disease Control. And the reason that CDC is interested in active transportation is because physical inactivity is a lead contributor to many chronic health conditions in the United States, including obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. Active transportation is a potential solution to mitigate some of these issues. If we zoom in specifically for New York State on obesity, we find that the rate of obesity in adults is rising. Here you can see in 1997, it was just over 40%, and as of 2016, it was at 60%. If we look at that data, the New York State Comptroller actually did a study of this in 2011 and found that the cost of childhood obesity was calculated at $327 million in associated medical costs. And for adults, that number was $11.8 billion annually in associated medical costs. And the reason that I bring this up in particular is because sometimes I go to communities and they say, oh, this stuff is all well and good, but we don't have the money. When you see numbers like this, when you see this kind of spending, I say we can't afford not to. And as you'll see later on in the presentation, there are many ways to implement Complete Street with little to no additional capital cost. So these things don't need to be expensive. Now, when we start to shift the conversation over to transportation and travel time, one of the reasons that we're more physically inactive is because our commutes are getting longer. And there are a variety of reasons for this. So there's population growth, there's congestion, there's poor state of good repair. We're spending more and more time in cars and not moving, as you can see from this data here. And just to put a finer point on that, if you look at mode share in New York State as of 2019, you'll see that statewide, 53% of New Yorkers are driving to their jobs. And I should say, this is a little bit of an illusion, because this blue here, this is public transit. This graph includes New York City. And this is almost 9 million people, 70% of which are using public transit every day, offsets our mode share a little bit. If you took New York City out of the equation, this number would be somewhere in the 70s, and in some of the more rural areas of the state, probably in the 90s. So a lot of New Yorkers are in their cars. A lot of New Yorkers are spending more time in their cars. So if we can apply active transportation to get out of our cars, it seems like a simple solution, right? Why not just walk or bike if we're within a reasonable distance? Well, take your pick, whether it's poor pavement conditions or lack of safe infrastructure. Maybe there's really dangerous wide intersections. There's congestion, fear of collision, high stress interactions with cars. I mean, there are so many reasons that people don't walk and bike to work, even if they are, again, within a distance where they could. And a lot of these barriers, while perceived, fear of collisions is, what it is. These are not unfounded, right? If we look at the data, these are bicycle and pedestrian injuries and fatalities in New York State. And what's unfortunate here, if you look at biking, for example, these fatalities and injuries in orange here have remained relatively flat since 2012. In fact, if we look at injuries, post-pandemic, bicycle and pedestrian injuries are on the rise again. Similarly, while we've had a minor, I would say, decline in bicycle or pedestrian fatalities, it's still relatively even and relatively high. So if we look at where these things are occurring, right, where are pedestrian fatalities specifically occurring, we're seeing that 25% of fatalities are happening at intersections, which is a very clear design issue. When things aren't happening at intersections, there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe there's not enough roadway space. So there are likely design issues at play in the roadscape. But when fatalities are occurring at intersections, the places where pedestrians are supposed to cross, there's something wrong with those intersections. So what do we do about these design issues? Enter complete streets. So complete streets, what is complete streets? Complete streets are streets that are designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. And to visualize that, if we do complete streets well, we are optimizing equity for all users and making sure that anybody, regardless of income or demographic, is able to take advantage of the street. Safety, obviously making sure that people are safe when they're walking, biking, driving, etc. on our roadways. When we do complete streets well, we're minimizing our environmental impact. We are optimizing transportation choices for all users, so you're not just stuck driving. We are enhancing mobility and ensuring that regardless of your ability, you're able to use the roadway like anybody else. We're ensuring that our community remains livable and a place that people want to be. If we're doing complete streets well, if we're increasing the amount of active transportation, we are creating better public health outcomes. And lastly, we are, partly because we're increasing livability, we are contributing to economic vitality of our community by ensuring that these are spaces that people want to hang out in. If we think about efficiency, this is what I said at the top of the webinar. Complete streets has a lot to do with efficiency. And this is a pretty stark image, to illustrate this concept. So if you were to take a busload of people, this is how much space it takes up on the roadway. Clearly, a very efficient mode of transportation. If you take that same busload of people and you put them all on bikes, this is how much space they take up on the roadway. If you take the same busload of people and you put them all in cars, your entire roadway is going to be packed with cars. And I don't show you this to say, oh boy, this is bad and we should put everybody on a bus. Not at all. Cars are important to our transportation system. They're not going away, especially in areas with less transit and less bike infrastructure. But what I am saying is we can rethink this paradigm, right? So if we can offset 50% of these trips on other modes, let's say we can convert this row of cars and this row of cars to bicycling and buses, suddenly we only have a need for 2 lanes of traffic, and we can use these 2 outer lanes for any number of things: a dedicated transit lane, protected bike lanes, not that you need it here, but extend the sidewalk and enable pedestrians more space to move. Highest and best use. What is the highest and best use of your space in your community? And how do we get there? How do we mix and match modes so that we're creating the most efficient streetscape for our needs? Beyond efficiency, when we think about the environmental impact of transportation, in New York, 34% of emissions come from transportation. And as you saw from the mode share chart earlier, most of that is because people are driving. Lots and lots of people are driving. So again, if we can offset some of those single occupancy vehicle car trips to transit, to biking, to walking, we can start to chip away at this number. From an equity standpoint, owning a car is very expensive. In 2015, AAA calculated the annual cost of owning a vehicle at $8,500. That was 2015, and especially today with inflation, it is much higher. But when you think about things like parking and insurance and maintenance and gas, it really does add up and creates a significant barrier for a lot of people who may not be able to afford a car. And if you put those people in places where a car is the only option, you are severely limiting access to food, access to good jobs, access to education, and so on. Complete Streets is about placemaking. So how do we create these spaces that people love to live, work, and play? We want, say, downtown centers to be hubs of activity that are cool to hang out, cafes and street seating and all these things. We want to make sure that our communities are not only cool and fun to attract businesses and people, but also unique, right? Not every downtown should look the same. Every community has a unique flavor, and we want our street design to reflect that. We're not going to talk too much about this today, but freight mobility is also a huge issue, which often gets left out of the conversation about complete streets. But especially in our economic corridors or our more commercial corridors, businesses need to get goods somehow. And this can come with negative impacts, or it can, come with less negative impacts. So what we're getting at here is we want to avoid things like this and shift more toward smaller modes, or at least if we need to have larger modes of freight delivery, finding ways to do it so that it does not impact our pedestrian heavy, bicycle heavy corridors to the extent possible. And again, to put a point on all this, sorry, I just need to plug in my computer and realize so I don't disappear on all of you. I'd like to use the town of Hamburg as a case study. For those of you who aren't familiar with Hamburg, this is a Rust Belt city or town it's in Western New York with a population of approximately 10,000. It really went into decline after the collapse of the steel industry and when a mall opened nearby. In 2001, state DOT was proposing, let's put quotes around improvement on the main street in Hamburg, which is called Route 62. You can see that right here in this image. And essentially what they wanted to do was add a lane of traffic and shorten the sidewalks in order to do that so that they could increase traffic flow. As you can imagine, the local constituents were not thrilled about this, so they formed a citizens advisory group and developed design alternatives, which ultimately were accepted and implemented in 2009. So what they did instead was they shortened they shortened the existing traffic lanes from 12 feet to 10 feet in order to reduce speeds. This enabled them to do a couple things. One, they were able to add street trees and on-street parking. They also added what they call safety lanes. This is 2001, so the lingo hadn't quite evolved to where it is today, but these are essentially de facto bike lanes. They also added roundabouts on either end of the main street, and they have some mid-block crossings. Curb extensions were put in at the intersections. I mean, just the whole suite of complete streets deployed here. Now, what's interesting is not so much the design, but the KPIs, the key performance indicators that they saw. So between completion in 2009 and 2013, car accidents on this street fell 66%, and pedestrian injuries fell 60%. Those are huge, huge numbers in just 4 years. From an economic standpoint, the number of building permits on Main Street increased from 15 in 2005, before the deployment of these this complete street design, to 96 in 2010, just 1 year after the complete street project was implemented. This also inspired a whole bunch of civic activity, including garden walks, street music festivals, soapbox derby. So you see here in these numbers that this stuff really does work. We can increase safety, we can increase economic vitality, and we can increase engagement. So just some tools to consider, some resources here. This is a walk audit tool. I'll talk a little bit about walk audits later, but there's a lot of resources to help you if you go out in your community and you want to evaluate different intersections or infrastructure. This is one of many things out there that you can use to guide your analysis. Also, I know this is a New York City resource, but there's a lot of great information in this active design sidewalk experience tools and resources toolkit, just to inspire you. So a lot of this may or may not be applicable to your community, but it's always great to get fresh ideas and to see what's possible and what's working. So now we're going to shift our conversation from the sort of broad, what is this, to design, and talk about what complete streets actually looks like. So to start things off, before we even get to our menu of design tools, we need to think about how we go about figuring out what that design should be. So there's a couple ways to do this. First, we start by recognizing what patterns are out there. So if you have goat paths, if you're not familiar, this is a picture of a goat path on the top here. It's an informal path that has clear signs of usage. So maybe there's a cut through on a corner that people are using rather than, you know, going some roundabout way. Maybe in order to get to the playground, all the kids cut through a certain patch of woods and it's leaving a trail. Well, there's something to that. Maybe that route makes more sense and we should think about formalizing. If we're thinking about planning a bike network, bikers are very good at finding the path of least resistance and finding comfortable routes. So if you're thinking about a bicycle network development plan, you should talk to your cyclists and understand where they're riding and why. Every community I go into always has some sort of like whispers or like urban legends about a project. Like, oh, they've been talking about converting that to a rail trail since the 70s, or, you know, oh, that intersection over there, everybody avoids it because blah, 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 or it's not safe here. There's something to those whispers and to those urban legends. You know, people are talking about them for a reason. So maybe we should think about those and think about them critically to see if there are design changes that we can make. And lastly, and most importantly, where are the kids hanging out? Are the routes to our parks, to our playgrounds, to schools, to the library, are they safe? Can kids get there without having us parents worry about, you know, if they're going to be able to make it across the street? These are all things to think about when we start the design process. So when it comes to actually selecting your design improvements, I like to think of it as a prioritized step ladder, right? And the way we determine the rungs on that step ladder are by transportation mode. So let's say we're dealing with a dense commercial, like downtown context, right? In that case, we probably are going to end up prioritizing walking and biking, maybe transit if we have a dense transit network. Maybe we want to prioritize taxis if we have them, then cars, then parking. For each of these modes, there's an entire menu of design tools that we should think about. So if walking and biking are our highest priorities here at the bottom of the stepladder, then we should be thinking about sidewalks and crosswalks and what kind of wayfinding and streetscaping we have. Same with bike lanes, protected lanes, trails, counters to track these things. Those are the types of infrastructure solutions that we should be prioritizing first. Now, I want to stress that this stepladder may not be your stepladder, right? Maybe you're in a more rural community and walking isn't going to be as efficient based on where you are. So you want to prioritize, say, biking, transit, and cars. I can't tell you what your stepladder should look like. Needless to say, this method works. What modes of transportation are important in your context and what design tools come along with them? That's a good way to prioritize. So if you come away from this training with one soundbite, I think it should be this. It's correct design invites correct use. And you see a pretty good illustration of that here, where on the top photo, you have a very wide, undefined street. Cars have tons of room. I mean, a car could basically be driving in the middle of here, and what is there to stop them? You have a person here who could cross at any point because there's no crosswalks, there's no curbs, so there's no clear delineation as to where the street ends. There's a curb cut here, but there's no curb cut here. So again, it's sort of like a wild west of streets. You can do whatever you want, and it's not safe because it's not predictable. In contrast, if we look at this intersection, very clear design. It's clear where pedestrians are crossing. It's clear where the street ends. It's clear how wide the lane is for cars in both directions. And it's predictable. That's the whole point of having rules on a roadway. It's to make the streets predictable so that pedestrians generally know what drivers are going to do and vice versa. So now we're going to sort of rummage through our complete street toolkit, and we're going to look at what design tools we have in there. The first sort of big picture tool is more of a concept, really. It's called a road diet. So for decades, roadway design has really been focused on maximizing space for cars. So what does that mean? It means that lanes were designed really wide to maximize vehicular flow. But here's the thing. We've realized, particularly in the last decade, that cars don't actually need all of that space. And the trouble is, because of that design, we're creating barriers for other modes. So when you have a wide intersection, it makes it a lot more difficult for pedestrians to cross, especially if we're looking at higher speed roadways. So the concept of a road diet is that lanes can be narrowed to A, create additional space for other uses, and B, to create a safer environment for everyone, including cars. Now, how is it going to make things safer? Well, road diets have shown to slow down vehicular speed, and this is so important because studies have shown us that at 40 miles per hour, if you are hit by a car, there's an 85% chance that you are not walking away from that. What's interesting to me is that if you look at a 10 mile per hour differential, it's really dramatic how much the fatality rate goes down. So look at 30 miles per hour here. So if you're hit by a car at 30 miles per hour, there's a 45% chance of a fatality. But then if we lower the speed to 20 miles per hour, you are more than likely going to walk away from an accident. So again, slowing down traffic speed saves lives. And just to put a pin in that, here is an example of a road diet. You see here kind of ambiguous as to how cars should be positioned on the roadway, lots of extra space. And just with a little bit of paint, look what we've done. We've narrowed the lane so that traffic slows down, and we've added a whole other use in both directions. So you have this bike lane. And again, think about it. This is just paint. There was no hard capital investment. This is just painting the roadway. Here's a sort of bigger picture example of a road diet. So this is Delancey Street in Manhattan. And I show you this not because it's necessarily relevant to your particular context, but it's a very clear example of a road diet. Very wide street, ambiguous turning methods, faded bike lane, wide crossing, transforms into a really beautiful crossing with extra space for pedestrians, a protected bike lane, clear delineations on the street as to where vehicles should be turning. You get the picture here. So, as I said, the road diet was kind of a concept. Now we're going to look specifically at those tools. So if we're talking about biking, there's essentially three major pieces of bike infrastructure that you're going to see out in the roadway. First is a protected bike lane. And the concept here is basically we're using parked cars or planters to physically separate cyclists on the roadway from moving traffic. In these examples here, essentially what you do is you take your parallel parking from the curbside and move it out 10 feet, which enables you to add a 5-foot buffer here and a 5-foot bike lane directly against the curb. Again, you don't need to do this with parking necessarily. You can do this with planters as well. This just enables you to keep your parking. This, aside from an off-street trail, this is the highest level of protection you can get for cyclists. That said, it does require a fair amount of space. Typically, your protected bike lanes are going to be reserved for your higher volume roadways. What you're more likely to see out there are the good old-fashioned bike lanes, as I call them. And essentially, this is just paint. It's a painted, delineated space on the roadway for cyclists. If you want to enhance visibility, particularly in high traffic locations where you don't have the space for a protected bike lane, you can fill in the bike lane with solid paint, whether it's green, whether it's red. I've seen all sorts of different things. The last piece of bike infrastructure that's particularly important are shared routes. So shared routes essentially are exactly what they sound like. These are roadways that enable cyclists to travel center lane along with traffic. Now, if you're trying to build out a bike network, this should not be the foundation. Shared routes are mainly for connections between different, more robust pieces of bike infrastructure. Typically, you'll see these on low volume roadways where there's either not space for a bike lane or there's not enough traffic volume. So you don't want to use these everywhere. One other design note, I tend to see communities that use these, put them sort of offset from the center of the lane. So if you do need to use a sharrow, as it's called, make sure you print it directly in the center of the lane. The reason for that is if you put this off to the right of the lane, closer to the parked cars, you're creating a dangerous condition for cyclists because cyclists will tend to follow the sharrow. So suddenly you have cyclists riding closer to parked cars, which in turn sort of encourages drivers behind them to pass them, which on a double yellow is especially dangerous because drivers are more likely to pass close to the cyclist than cross far over the double yellow. So again, we don't want to create that false sense of positioning. Sharrows should be printed center lane in the roadway if they're going to be used. And of course, sharrows should be accompanied by signage. So sidewalks. Sidewalks are actually really complicated places. They're not just places like concrete that we walk on. If we think about sort of a downtown urban context, there are 4 major parts of a sidewalk. One is the edge zone. This is where the street meets the curb. You're going to probably find things like, parking meters. Maybe you have a newspaper stand. Maybe there's some seating. There's a furnishing zone. And this is where, you know, if you have restaurants, this is where they'll put tables and other outdoor seating. Maybe you have some street trees. This is where you're going to find that sort of stuff. Bike parking would be in the furnishing zone. In the next zone, the throughway zone, that's where pedestrians are actually walking. So the key there is to make sure that it's clear. And then your building frontage zone is directly in front of businesses. Again, maybe this is outdoor seating for restaurants and cafes. Maybe it's stands with goods on them for sale. There's a lot of different things that you can do with that frontage zone. In a more rural or suburban context, you still have the same sort of framework, right? Again, it's not just concrete that we walk on. You still have that edge zone where the curb meets the street. You still have that furnishing zone, but in the rural context, it's more of a curb planter zone where you're going to see grass, trees, plantings, that sort of thing. You still have a throughway zone where we keep pedestrians walking, and then your frontage zone, it still exists, but it's going to look different in this context. So maybe it's someone's front yard. Maybe it's a retaining wall like you see here. There's any number of things, but it's again, another consideration in a more rural context. Maybe there's overgrowth that we need to be concerned about, or another condition that we need to maintain differently than we would a building frontage zone in a more urban context. So in really rural, let's say not rural, but less dense areas, it doesn't necessarily make sense to put in a sidewalk along every curb, which is where shared use sidewalks and side paths come in. And these are essentially mixed use trails for pedestrians and cyclists. So these essentially run along the roadway, as you see here. This picture here is in Rome, where they have a lot of wide open space, but these trails go all throughout the city. Now, one important consideration with side paths is how different users access them. So if you have a cyclist on the roadway that's trying to access the side path, we need to be thinking about, you know, what is the transition onto the side path from the roadway in both directions. Similarly with pedestrians, you know, I'm assuming from this diagram that there's some sort of facility here and that pedestrians aren't just going to an open pasture. But how are pedestrians accessing this side path facility? Curb extensions are a really important tool. And essentially what these do is they bump out the edges of the curb, which in turn narrows the roadway and slows down traffic speed. Most importantly, it shortens the crossing for pedestrians. And for the drivers out there, if you think you're not getting any benefit out of this, you actually are, because this adds protection for parking. So vehicles that could make a sharp right turn here and could potentially sideswipe or just hit a car that's parked along the curb, suddenly they have to make this turn, you know, a wider turn, and there's no way that they're going to turn into a vehicle that's parked on this roadway. Now, these can be done sort of the hard capital way or the sort of soft paint way. You see two examples of that here. Here's concrete, but this is just paint and some bollards. And what's great about this particular example, the curb extension actually becomes public space in this particular context. So you can see that there's some street seating here, there's bikes parked here, and people just hanging out. Speed bumps, you all know them, you know what they are. I think the important note here is that you can do, again, there's sort of the hard way, or the capital intensive way, which has actual concrete on the asphalt, there's a physical bump in the roadway that's either cement or asphalt, or you can get these hard rubberized speed bumps that are modular and can be taken out or moved as needed. Crosswalks are really important. The most important thing with crosswalks is that they need to be as visible as possible. And the reason for this is that it improves driver awareness at the crossings. There's a lot of ways to make crosswalks really visible. You can use highly reflective paint. You can use pedestrian actuated signals like you see here. Another important consideration is keeping crossing short. People are more likely to cross the roadway if they are comfortable doing so. So the shorter the crossing, the easier it is for pedestrians and especially people in wheelchairs to get across. One additional thing, there's expensive ways and there's inexpensive ways to do things. On the expensive end, in terms of visibility, this is a really cool intersection that I saw in Malaga, Spain, where there's sort of pressurized sensors in this crosswalk, and when you step on them, these LEDs light up. So as you're crossing, they turn on, vehicles yield, and then after you step off, they start blinking, and then once they're off again, cars will go. But again, that's fairly expensive. You don't necessarily need to have really fancy technology to be effective. Parking's an issue in every community I go into. There's a lot of different types of parking on street. There's parallel parking. There's also angled parking, but this is disappearing. Most communities are recognizing that this presents too many dangers to drivers and cyclists and walkers. So what's replacing it is what's called reverse angle parking. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically taking that angled parking and turning it on its head so that you actually back into the space rather than pull into the space. And this is important because as a driver, you have full 180-degree view to the left and to the right of everything going on around you as you are pulling out of the space. One thing I will say about reverse angle parking is that if you do this, it is so important to make the public aware that you're doing this in the first place, and two, to make sure that you have regulatory signage that explains how to actually do it. And basically, I've seen many different iterations of signs that do the same thing. 1, pull forward, 2, back up, 3, stay in the space. It's new for a lot of people, so you have to educate before you get rolling, and you have to make sure that there's supportive signage wherever you're doing this. Bike parking, I actually have some local examples here from Megan, but bike parking is great for a couple reasons. Number one, it's not enough to just put in bike lanes, right? As a cyclist, I can tell you if I'm going to bike somewhere, I want to make sure there's a safe place to leave my bicycle. So bike parking enables us to park our bikes and attract cyclists to businesses or schools or wherever. More importantly, though, bike parking doesn't just need to have a single purpose. It's not just about the function. It can also be about the form. So bike parking is an important placemaking tool. And as you can see here, your bike racks can be designed any which way to create that sort of unique local context. If we treat bike parking as a sculptural element of our streetscape, we're helping that placemaking element. We're helping to drive home that uniqueness of our community. And you see a couple examples of that here. Everything from the plain old U rack to a branded rack in Buffalo to these really funky designs, which I really like. I especially like this this donkey here. It's either a donkey or a horse. I'm not sure. Anyway, the sort of ultimate evolution of bike parking is the bike corral. So essentially, this is taking a parked car, the space for a parked car, and turning it into bike parking on the street. Again, this can be a sort of sculptural placemaking element, depending on how it's situated. This is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think this particular bike rack gets a point across, which is highest and best use. If you think about a car parking space that serves one individual, what's a higher and better use of a parking space? Is it a car for one person, or is it 6 to 8 cyclists? You tell me. Again, it depends on the context, but that's just a calculus to do in your head as you're thinking about this different infrastructure. ADA accessibility. So a core tenet of complete streets, as I've said, is making sure that our sidewalks, our streets are as accessible as possible, regardless of age or ability. Needless to say, we could spend an entire day talking about ADA accessibility and tools. But there are so many things out there. It's exciting to live in a time where we have tools to enable mobility for so many. But think about people with mobility impairments. Think about people who can't see or hear as well as you can. Think about people in wheelchairs. How do they experience a crosswalk or a sidewalk? Streetscaping and public art, really important. We've already talked about placemaking a lot, but public art isn't just about placemaking. It can also be an important traffic calming tool. So you see here, this sort of painted streetscape. Studies have shown that when you do this, it tends to slow down traffic speeds. So again, things like bike parking, things like public art, they don't have to just serve one function. They can have very important, beyond their sort of functionality, their core functionality, they can help us to calm traffic, and they can help shape our built environment. Here's an example. In Rochester, they actually have something called the Boulevard Program, where they select intersections and they put these designs on the street. It's a great community building activity. And also, again, it's all about the traffic calming. So people are going to tend to go slower through these intersections as people are crossing. Here's another topic. We could spend an entire webinar talking about environmental considerations, but needless to say, there's an entire ecosystem of environmental considerations when we are doing complete streets, everything from runoff to plantings to, how much sunlight is hitting our streets and sidewalks. These are things that are really important, and complete streets can help us reduce our environmental impact, number one, but number two, create a streetscape that sort of works with these different environmental factors. So as far as design, we have barely scratched the surface on all the tools that are out there to redesign your streetscape. I would highly suggest that you take a look at some of these resources. NACTO has some great guides. If you're dealing with a state roadway or a state funded project, you're going to want to look at AASHTO guides. This is the AASHTO Bicycle Facility Guide. That's typically what states use as their design standard. And if you're curious about freight, I know we didn't talk about it in the design section here, but NYSERDA has a really great guide about integrating freight, like how you address delivery challenges in different contexts. So having said that, now's the fun part. Let's take a walk. Let's sort of use some of the tools that we just talked about to evaluate a few intersections in your area. So couple rules of the road here. Typically, if we were in person, we'd talk about safety. I think you're all good in front of your computers, so we'll skip that. But two, the second thing that I typically talk to groups about when I do walk audits is to think of all users. You may walk down the same street or use the same crosswalk every day, but how is somebody else going to experience that intersection? How is a cyclist going to experience that intersection? How is someone in a wheelchair going to experience that intersection? It's really important to think outside the box and take a walk in someone else's shoes when you're doing this type of work. The last piece here, typically when I do a walk audit, I will sort of if we get to an intersection, I'll take a poll of the group and think about, on a scale of 0 to 10, how we would rate an intersection, 0 being absolutely horrendous and 10 being incredible. So we can't do that with such a big group, so I'm gonna sort of narrate this myself. But I will do the best I can. And I lastly want to acknowledge the limitations of a virtual walk audit. Obviously we're not actively observing driver and pedestrian behavior. I have found that Street View is not always up to date. There's a lot of different planning projects that are in various stages of development that we can't capture. So work with me. and I think this will be an illustrative exercise. So let's talk about this intersection, which is in Syracuse. So we're looking at Salina, Harrison, and Onondaga Street. There's a lot going on here. If I had to rate this, I would probably give it a 3.5, maybe even a 4. And, looking at this or knowing this intersection, you might think I'm a little crazy, but, just because on first glance, an intersection might look a little scary, it doesn't mean that there aren't elements for us to celebrate and enhance. So let's talk about some of the positives, right? So there's some very nice brick features along the sidewalk here. There is a protected bike lane here on Onondaga Street. You have some one-way streets, which is great. So there's a little bit less traffic volume than you might see if there were, multi-directional streets. But there are clearly some geometric challenges here that create very wide sort of diagonal intersections. So you see that here. One thing I also like is that there's a ton of great sidewalk space. So there's a lot of room to walk. There's places where we could add street trees. There's places we could add street seating. So again, not the worst intersection, not the best. We could clearly use a little bit more, design enhancement to make this a little more comfortable for all roadway users. So what could we do here? At a minimum, I think shortening some of these crossings with curb bump outs would be great. It would also help us to sort of direct vehicular traffic by sharpening some of these turns. When you have more space, vehicles can make wider turns, which is kind of unpredictable, particularly for pedestrians crossing the street. That said, sorry, we don't need this. One thing I was thinking about, what would happen if we were to put in a roundabout here? It's something that could work. I think it would help direct traffic a little bit better. It would also enable us to move traffic a little bit more efficiently here. On Harrison Street, if we did add a traffic circle, we could remove at least one lane of traffic here. You see there's a left turning lane. We wouldn't need that anymore. So we could potentially expand the sidewalk, maybe add a bike lane. There's tons of different things we could do with that space. So again, this is not me as a consultant telling you what you should do. These are just some ideas that I see based on the existing conditions. Also adding a crosswalk here, very easy lift, just to make sure that people know they can cross there. So continuing on Salina Street, this is Salina and Southland Avenue, very different context. If I had to rate this intersection, again, I think this is not the worst intersection in the world. I would probably give this, again, a 3.5, maybe a 4. What do we have that works here? We have a center median, which I think has a lot of potential. Now, that said, even though we have this center median, it's short, right? It doesn't intersect with the crosswalk. And as you can see here, these turning vehicles just sort of, they take up a lot of space on the crosswalk as they're turning. Additionally, there's no walking space on Southland Drive here. And you actually see in the street view, somebody walking along the side of the road here, not exactly the safest condition. And if you are crossing Salina, there is a single crosswalk. So if you're coming from over here, where there's clearly a lot of parking, you have to walk all the way over here to get across the street. So a couple things that might be helpful here. One, putting a crosswalk in on the other side of the street, and then a series of curb extensions to shorten all of these crossings. Most importantly, I think extending the center median is really key. Because this intersection is so wide, think if someone's in a wheelchair, they might not have enough time to get across this crosswalk. So we have a refuge here where they can hang out while we wait for the light to change. In addition, there is tons of space on Southland Drive in both directions here. I would recommend shortening these lanes to 12 feet, which is plenty of space, and adding a sidewalk on either side. Again, ideas for inspiration. So, East Brighton and East Seneca. What do we have that works? What doesn't work? If I had to rate this intersection, I am sorry to say that I would probably give this a 1. I think that's being fairly generous. A couple issues here. Number one, there's only one crosswalk. I mean, there's there's a lot of use happening over here. There's a lot of stuff happening over here. So maybe there would be crossover between these businesses, but you have to come all the way over here in order to get there. And when you do, there's no way to get across the street. On this corner here, I know this is a gas station, but it's really unclear if this is walking space or parking space or what's happening here because it's all black, it's all asphalt. So it's not the most exciting or safe or supportive piece of walking infrastructure. Now, we do have some positives. Why is this not a 0? One, we have an ADA compliant curb ramp right here, which was very surprising. We also have a median here. Now, this is mainly for turning traffic, but this is something we can build on. So if I were to improve this intersection, a couple things that I would do, again, curb bump outs, I think could do a lot of good here to help us reduce traffic speed and shorten those crossings. But importantly, we need crosswalks here. And I don't think it's a heavy lift to put a crosswalk here and to use this center median to get us to this gas station if we need to go there or across the street to Dunkin' Donuts. One other thing, somehow we don't necessarily need to put in a sidewalk, which can be very expensive, but putting some sort of, indication that this is walking space. Maybe it's walking like a pedestrian symbol with chevrons or something here so that people know it's safe and okay to be walking in this space. You really want to take that to the next level, making sure that there is a clear curb and a driveway, restricting the driveway into this gas station is something else that we can think about. So the last area I'm going to talk about is Main Street, North Street, and South Street. I understand that this picture is outdated and there are improvements that have either happened or are underway right now. But just from what I can see, if I had to rate this, I would probably give it a 4, maybe a 5. It's not the worst. It's not the most unsafe thing I've ever seen, and there are some positives here. For example, there are existing curb extensions, very wide sidewalks, which is great because this is a commercial area. Also, this corner here is daylit, and what that means is as a driver approaches an intersection, their view is not obstructed by parked cars, right? So the parking has been moved from the corner so that you can actually see what's going on as you're approaching an intersection. At the same time, there are challenges here, clearly. One is crosswalk placement. I get it that there's some geometry issues here, but in order to cross the street, you sort of have to go all the way over here, or you have to go all the way over here to get to the other side. This is a little pet peeve of mine, so take it with a grain of salt, but I hate it when I go to a community and there are different crosswalk designs. It's just not a consistent experience for pedestrians. So you see that here, you have the double bar here, and then you have the step ladder here. Let's keep it consistent. It's really, think of yourself as a pedestrian. We probably intuitively know that we can cross at both these locations, but if it's consistent, it feels connected, and it's better. That's my opinion. Last thing, and I understand that this has been taken care of, but The parking transition here from parallel to sort of this perpendicular parking is a little strange. So that's something that I would want to address. That said, here are some small improvements. Curb extension here to shorten this particular crossing. Curb extension here where this crosswalk is. Putting in a new crosswalk here so it's a little easier and more efficient to cross the street. And then additional bump outs here. I would also, consider, and I believe this is what happened, but converting this into parallel parking so that there's a consistent parking experience, and so we have more space to maybe put some street seating out for the brewing company here. There's a lot we could do with the space that I think is being wasted now. That's our walk audit. So again, that is not me recommending specific design improvements. That's just sort of talking through what possibilities are out there to address challenges that we see. So for the remainder of the webinar, we're going to talk about policy right now. We're going to get to implementation, and then we're going to round things out by talking about performance management. But I'll pause. Megan, was there anything from the walk audit or anything that you think is particularly relevant that we want to address before I plow through the rest of the content here?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't get any questions specifically on the walk audit, but we did have a few questions earlier. I think one of them, there was a question about speed bumps and crosswalks. So maybe the question was about raised crosswalks. I don't know if there's anything you can say about that. And then there was also a question about crosswalks or other, just how to cross pedestrians safely at intersections that might not have sidewalks. So maybe in a more suburban context, I guess.
Sure. So first with raised crosswalks, they're great. They're visible. They function as speed bumps, but they are expensive. That does require an expenditure of capital, whether you're talking about creating, like using some sort of rubberized platform, or whether you're using like a raised piece of asphalt. It's expensive to do. So I full-heartedly endorse them, but it's going to be cost prohibitive in a lot of places. As far as rural crossings, so you saw side paths are really sort of the gold standard in less dense areas, like rural and suburban areas. Ultimately, there's only so much I can say here, because if there's no space for pedestrians to cross, so if you're walking on a series of lawns, that's not necessarily safe to begin with. So crossings, I think, you could put in a crosswalk to nowhere without a problem. I mean, you could put in bump outs. You could do all that across any road, but if the crosswalk isn't landing anywhere, you have to ask yourself,
Looks like we have an issue with a couple of frozen computers here. So we'll just give us a quick minute. Sorry for technical difficulties.
Hello, everyone. I apologize. My computer seems to have overheated and turned off. Give me 1 second while I recover here. But I was in the middle of saying that, you know, it's if you have an area that doesn't have sidewalks, then there are bigger issues than the crossing itself that need to be addressed. Just give me 1 second here while I am getting the presentation up and running again. Are there any other questions that came up during the presentation, Megan?
Megan, it doesn't look like we're getting any audio from you. So just a quick,
Okay.
there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
But you can't hear anybody else.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dan. Can anybody else hear Dan? Maybe just do a thumbs up a little. Okay, excellent. All right.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. I realized that I'm on a different device right now. So I was just asking if there were any additional questions while I'm getting the presentation queued back up here. Hang on, almost there. Materials. Okay. Webinar. Okay, hang on. Ay, ay, ay. Okay. All right. So I do have the presentation up here. Let me share my screen again, and then we can get rolling. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Okay. Let me share my screen. Can you guys enable the host sharing for me so I can put the presentation back up?
Yeah, I'm working on that right now, Dan. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, let's give it a shot. Share. Screen. Okay. Give me 1 second. For other apps. This is right. Okay. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Well, yes, yep, we can.
Dan, I just made you a co-host again.
It's a good way.
Okay,
to,
wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, so you can see this?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, I apologize for the delay and the technical difficulties. My computer seems to have given up. So here we go. Let's talk about policy here. So why do communities need a complete street policy in the first place? Well, a complete street policy is important because it represents an official mandate to work toward an integrated transportation network for all users, and to establish a reporting framework to keep track of these initiatives. So one of the things that's really important with a policy, if it's well written, you can start to establish, or you can codify that design step ladder that we talked about earlier. So for example, this is from Albany's Complete Streets Policy and Design Guide. And essentially what they do here is they indicate where their highest priorities are in terms of investment. So in a downtown context, you'll see that, for example, in principal arterials, they prioritize pedestrian zones, turning lanes, bicycle zones, and parking zones. So this is something that your complete street policy can codify so that it's easier to make decisions about design. So I don't know how many of you have actually read a complete street policy or resolution, but the resolutions in particular tend to have a lot of whereas language in them. Each of these orange boxes represents one of those whereases and what they mean. So there's always your community vision, which is sort of your local contextualized definition of complete streets. There's the policy intent, which is essentially your mission statement. And there's not one correct intent or vision. It's up to you and your community. Scope of applicability is how is this policy applicable? What does it apply to? Is it new, new projects? What stakeholders are involved, et cetera? Projects and phasing just indicates where the complete street the policy comes into play. So is it retroactive? Is it looking at all new projects moving forward? Exceptions are where a lot of policies tend to fall flat on their faces. You want to make sure that you have a very rigorous process in place for exceptions to your complete street policies, because if it's really easy to get an exception, every developer, every municipal investment is going to try to get an exception. Commitment to an integrated transportation network. Again, this is thinking about projects in a larger context. So you're not just going to do put an ADA compliant curb ramp in the middle of nowhere. We're going to be thinking about investments that build off of our transportation network and create connectivity for everyone. Design standards, this is where you indicate what you're going to use for design. So, your local Department of Public Works has design standards, or your county Department of Public Works. But some of the resources I've shown you earlier might help you integrate additional design solutions. So those NACTO guides, the AASHTO guides, you might say in your policy, we're going to use our county or our local design standard for roadway projects. However, we'll look to X, Y, and Z if there's something in our local design standard that we don't know how to do or we haven't done before. Context sensitivity, making sure that we're putting the right treatments in the right places. Again, you're not going to put a protected bike lane on a really long rural roadway because it just doesn't make a lot of sense unless there's a ton of bicycle volume. It's just not going to make a lot of sense. Performance measures, these are the things that we're going to track. We'll talk about this in the next section. And then implementation mandates are, how long is this policy going to last, and what are our benchmarks? What's going to happen in a year, 2 years, 3 years? How often are we going to be tracking those KPIs that were established in that last section? So one thing that you can do with your complete street policy is you can create, let's call them design packages. So a school zone, for example, is something that you can bake into your policy and say, look, if a roadway meets these criteria, then we will deploy these infrastructure solutions. State DOT has a formula for school zone implementations if you're on a state roadway. But locally, you should be thinking about, what sort of design treatments would we want to bake in here so that we can deploy them based on specific criteria without worrying about additional red tape and such. This is an example from New York City. Again, this neighborhood slow zone basically says, okay, in a 5x5 block radius, here are design tools we can implement to make a specific area more bicycle and pedestrian friendly. And then for some tools and resources, Albany's Complete Street and Design Manual, Complete Street Policy and Design Manual is really well done. And then Smart Growth America's local policy workbook can help you think through the different pieces of a complete street policy and develop your own. So implementation. This slide, unfortunately, I'm looking at this via PDF. This has all sorts of funky animation, but basically in the background here, you see an idyllic complete street landscape, rendering. It looks great. Everybody's happy. But if you start to break things down, it suddenly gets really complicated. Your Department of Public Works or state DOT might control that roadway. Your transit agency is going to be operating on that roadway. You've got a chamber of commerce that's going to be really interested and concerned about what's happening in front of their businesses. And then you have a very diverse group of stakeholders, from young people to the elderly. There's someone in a wheelchair, there's bicyclists. This gets really complicated when we're starting to think about how we achieve this vision. So it's really important to understand the roles of various actors and what role they play when it comes to specific technical issues. This is a flow chart. I actually developed this as part of the National Guide on Bicycle Integration with Transit. And what's important here is not so much what it says as how the process that it runs you through. So for example, if we're looking at a customer concern, which is how do I get to transit via bicycle? Well, for planners and policymakers, it's a safe routes to transit issue. And here are the roles that different actors play. So the transit agency, even though we're talking about transit customers, is an influencer, right? They don't control the right of way. The public sector, the Department of Public Works, planners, et cetera, the public sector needs to take a lead role in that. The private sector may vary. Maybe you can get funding, maybe there's specific amenities that private like businesses or developers can put in to support safe routes to transit. And advocates, they're also influencers on that particular issue. So again, breaking down issues or designs this way helps you figure out how you sort of get to the heart of the matter and figure out a strategy for getting something implemented. So steps to implementation, first, restructuring and updating existing plans, updating your design guidelines to include things like curb bump outs and specific types of crosswalks. Educating staff and stakeholders is really important. You might have somebody who just doesn't quite understand these concepts working at your city or town or village, and just walking them through the benefits and why these things are important is really key, because you want to create that buy-in. In order to demonstrate the feasibility of complete streets projects, pilots are really great to get the conversation started and to ultimately illustrate their success. And then lastly, I would argue most importantly, is measuring performance, making sure that you are tracking things from start to finish and developing a data set, which in turn can help you demonstrate how great Complete Streets is, but also attract additional funding sources. So short-term pilots are really great, especially when you're dealing with new treatments. Let's say you've never done a bike lane in your community. Well, a pilot is a great way to maybe cut around some of that red tape and eliminate certain roadblocks that might come up if you were doing a full-scale implementation. These will help you develop the proof of concept. They'll enable you to experiment a bit so you're not locked into a specific design solution, get the community engaged and attract new funding once it works. you'll all look at Times Square here on the right. This is a massive pilot. There was so much congestion on the sidewalks that they decided to shut down Broadway, and it worked, and it's incredibly successful, and it's spread. Now, if you walk the length of Broadway in Midtown, you have Broadway's closed off in Times Square, near Penn Station, near Flatiron. I mean, it's evolved since the initial pilot. Tag-along projects are another way to streamline implementation. The best example of this is a street milling project. So let's say you've got a lot of potholes. The Department of Public Works is going to come in and repave the street. Well, they're also going to have to repaint the street once it's repaved. So if you do the work up front and you have a new roadway design, let's say you're creating a road diet, putting in some bike lanes or something, if you have that design approved and on the books, when the millers come out and they ultimately have to repaint the street, suddenly they have a complete street design ready to implement, and it eliminates the added capital of sending people out to reconfigure the roadway. This gets a lot of bang for the taxpayer's buck, as it were. So let's talk about some complete street myths. I'm going to go through each of these. First, businesses often get a little paranoid when we start to talk about taking parking away, but studies have shown us that businesses that abut complete street infrastructure, like bike lanes, wider sidewalks, etc., tend to see higher gross sales and business activity. So I often have emergency services, really concerned about complete streets. But the truth is that if you do a road diet correctly, you can open up the street to make it more predictable and provide additional space for emergency vehicles. And you see a great example of that here, where this new turning lane suddenly becomes an emergency lane. I would also say, yes, this is sort of anecdotal and whatever, but like, if you are doing complete streets well, theoretically, you are reducing traffic accidents and reducing the need for emergency vehicles. We don't have the money for this. Well, as I've just shown you, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money, especially if we're talking about tag-along projects, to implement complete streets. It just won't work here. Our community is too unique, or we're not Portland or New York City. Well, it's those unique elements that make complete street projects special in any given community. We talked about placemaking earlier. Capitalizing on your community assets is what makes complete streets work. So, jumping back to money for a second, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we're short on time, but there's a lot of federal funding out there. There are state funds out there, and there's also private funding out there to fund complete streets. Generally speaking, when it comes to private funding sources, you're never going to get property owners to give you cash, but you could potentially get a landowner to give you an easement for, say, a trail or a sidewalk. Businesses also won't necessarily be the first people in line to invest in complete street infrastructure, but if you can demonstrate value to the business, either the employees or the customers, you might be able to move the needle. So, for example, putting in a bike corral in front of the cafe, maybe they won't necessarily pay for it, but in New York City, for example, if there's a bike corral put in place, New York City DOT will work with the businesses as maintenance partners. So DOT will install it, plan it, and install it, and then the businesses will make sure it's swept, report any abandoned bikes, etc. Developers, that tends to be where the private money tends to be. You have a lot of power when it comes to developers. So, you don't want to be overly restrictive because you want developers to come to your community and invest in your community. But at the same time, at a minimum, you should make sure that curb ramps around any new development projects are ADA compliant. Anything they're doing connects to existing infrastructure, or if you don't have connections to a development, maybe there's a development cropping up in a more rural area, having them fund the development of sidewalks or side paths to get there is really important. So the last section we have here, and I know we're just about at time, but this will be quick, I promise, is evaluation. There's a lot of things that we can measure. Some of them are short-term, which you see in green. Some of them are like bigger picture, long-term measurements. So let's talk about those one-on-one in just a second. When you're developing a data set, it's really important to first prioritize the outcomes that are important to your community, and then develop a methodology around those outcomes. Before you start a complete street project, you want to establish a baseline. And then once you have that baseline, you want to set a regular schedule to continually reevaluate those metrics that you came out with in step one. So this shorter term metrics, one, traffic accidents. You can always get this from your local police department in varying levels of granularity, but it's always out there. It's a very common metric. Traffic volume, this is the number of bikes, cars, or pedestrians on the street. You can also look at vehicle turn movements. There's a lot of different traffic volume measures out there. Traffic speed, this again, you can sort of get tangentially from your police department. If, you can look at instances of, speeding violations in your community, or you can send somebody out with a speed gun to measure speeds in a specific area if you need to. When it comes to economic vitality, there's a couple things we can measure for commercial activity. Businesses aren't necessarily going to share their revenue, but looking at sales tax receipts in businesses abutting complete street improvements can help you get a sense of increased commercial activity. You can study business engagement. You can do surveys of people, using businesses. You can survey business owners. You can also just go out on a Saturday night and count how many people are in street seating in your downtown commercial corridor. And as far as commercial vacancies go, this is really important because it tells us, whether businesses are active and interested in being in our community. So looking at building permits, looking at the number of vacant storefronts are all key metrics. So downstream outcomes, these are things that don't necessarily change year over year, but we want to study in the long term. So public health, think about things like asthma and obesity rates. Public safety, it's interesting. Crime rates can go down relatively quickly, but perceptions of safety do take time to change. So that's just something to keep in mind. Environmental outcomes, air quality, water quality, unless you have a COVID level event where people suddenly stop driving, these things do take quite a while to demonstrate impact. There's a lot of tools and resources out there. I will provide these in a bibliography after the training. But lots and lots of KPIs to measure. So quick review, active transportation is any self-propelled human-powered mode of mobility. Complete streets are streets for everyone. There are many, many tools out there, like a lot that we didn't even scratch the surface on. I suggest that you look at some of those design guides that I mentioned earlier and will be in the bibliography that I provide. Complete Streets should establish an integrated transportation system that connects different modes and enables optimal transportation choices. Don't forget about freight mobility. It's important. Sorry, this is an old PDF. Cuomo should not be there. But Complete Streets policies set the tone and establish guidelines for future street improvements. Implementation is complicated, but can be streamlined with cooperation and education of different stakeholders. And last one, evaluation is really critical to tracking success and setting community goals. I know we are over time, but I'm happy to stick around and answer a few questions, and we'll answer everything else in writing. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thanks, Dan. And we're still trying to figure out the source of the technical difficulties. It may have been on our end too. So I think we've all had it happen to us. So apologies to everybody. But thank you all for sticking with us. I'm not seeing any questions come into the chat or any hands raised. I did put our contact information into the chat. If you do think of questions later on, you can always email us, and we'll try to get answers to that. Oh, okay. Do you have a question? Jay, you should be able to unmute. Yep.
Hi, yeah, Jay Lambrix. The only thing, one thing I'm concerned about actually is the good, as you put it, the regular bike lanes. Because I'm just, in my research, looking at the vast majority of potential cyclists on the road, those who are interested but concerned. I'm just worried that kind of infrastructure is not going to entice interested but concerned cyclists into using the roadways. And I'm just wondering if, I haven't seen any statistics indicating that they would be comfortable with that kind of infrastructure, but I was just wondering if you knew of any.
Sure. So a great point, and a couple things. First and foremost, some people on this call must be aware, but Urban Cycling Solutions, we are actually in the process of administering the New York cycling census. And as of today, we have more than 12,600 responses across every single county in New York State. And this is the largest statewide survey, like consumer survey of cyclists ever conducted. So we're really, really excited to have new data that we've never had here in New York State, or any state really before, about barriers to cycling. What's holding back those interested but concerned cyclists from biking to transit, biking to the grocery store, biking to work? The results, so the cycling census is going to remain open through the end of Bike Month, so May 31st. After that, we're going to start diving into the results and analyzing all of that data, and then produce a report later this year that sort of outlines our findings. So that's one piece of good news for you. There is new, exciting, unprecedented data on its way with regard to cycling preferences. Having said that, I hear you 100%. A bike lane in isolation is not going to necessarily, get somebody interested but concerned on their bike. Because guess what? If you've only got one bike lane, that means that bike lane doesn't necessarily go where they want it to go, number one. But number two, it definitely doesn't connect them for the whole journey. So I would say this. Bike lanes and isolations, no, are not going to work well. But if you create a network of bike lanes, that's when you start to get traction. If you know that you can generally get from your house to, say downtown in a bike lane, that is a game changer. Or let's say maybe not from your house, maybe you can drive somewhere in your community. But if you know once you drive there, hey, I can bike from the school to the post office to the park, that's where you start to get that interested but concerned group on the road. You need the network, you need connectivity.
Yeah, and another thing is oftentimes I see automobiles having difficulty distinguishing between a bike lane and a shoulder. Oftentimes they treat the bike lane the same way that they would treat a shoulder. I mean, we see across the country, issues with, painted bike lanes, having cars parked in them, cases of double parking. And it's very dangerous because, unfortunately, cyclists have to veer into traffic in order to get around these parked vehicles. And it's just, when you have interested but concerned cyclists, seeing that kind of interaction between, a painted line and large moving vehicles, it's very hard to sell those kinds of bike lanes.
Definitely. And, that's not a unique problem in your area, as you've alluded to. This happens virtually everywhere. And unless you have protected lanes, particularly in denser areas, you're always going to get trucks pulling in, to make deliveries. You're always going to have people double parking. I think there's two pieces of this. Number one, and this is not necessarily something that can be controlled locally, but we need to do a better job at educating drivers about a changing streetscape. And it's not just bike lane. It's thinking about crosswalks. It's thinking about, different types of parking and how they work. The drivers are stuck in a mode that's been developed over decades of, like I said, roadway design was designed for cars. So our education system for drivers is focused, as it always has been, on the driving element instead of thinking more globally about driving as a one user in a multimodal space. So that's a big picture policy change. If you're ever talking to your legislators, that's something to bring up. But the other thing is, I think there are local policies that we can put in place, to better enforce bike lanes so that they have more stringent borders. Periodically putting up bollards in certain places might be helpful, depending again on the density. It's not going to create a protected bike lane, but it will increase visibility and make parking in them more difficult. There are a lot of ways that you can harden the good old fashioned bike lane. It kind of depends on the context. It requires more driver education. And I think ultimately enforcement is really key here. I think we're still in an enforcement context that doesn't, that isn't great at recognizing that the sort of sovereignty, I guess, of different roadway uses. So there's a lot that needs to change. I do think that density is really key. So the denser the bike network, the more visible bike lanes are, the more aware drivers become. So it gets back to that same point for the interested but concerned cyclists. We need more bike lanes in order to increase that visibility and increase comfortability amongst different population. Any other questions?
And there's a question in the chat just about education. And do you know of any examples of communities that are doing a good job with a bike ped driver education program? I guess maybe that would be a good model.
You lost me at driver. So I'll say that there's a lot of really, really great examples of bicycle and pedestrian safety trainings right here in New York State. I know how sometimes communities feel about bringing up a New York City example, but in New York City, Bike New York really does an incredible job getting people of all ages and abilities on bikes. Everything from on bike learn to ride classes to street safety skills to virtual presentations. There's a lot to learn there as a case study for bicycling and walking. Unfortunately, when it comes to driving, I think there's a deficiency here. Number one, the driver's test doesn't have a mandatory question dealing with bikes, which is a policy issue. There are some examples, again, think about New York City, where drivers are sentenced, rather than a ticket, are sentenced to take a bike class, like an hour and a half bike class, a bike safety class, so they understand different users on the roadway. That's a pretty cool idea, but it requires buy-in from people in the justice system, and I realize I'm sort of stumbling here, but I think the answer is that there aren't great trainings on the driver's side, and that's something that needs to change.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good perspective. So I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. I understand people probably need to get going. Again, apologize for the technical difficulties. I hope everyone is on our email list already or follows our Facebook page. We will likely have our next forum on active transportation in, what would it be, July or probably August, actually, sometime over the summer. and we'll probably return to our usual format of having a guest speaker and then our member agency partners available to answer questions or talk about their latest active transportation related projects. So if anybody has a great idea for a guest speaker for that summer Forum on Active Transportation meeting, feel free to email us and let us know. I don't know at this point if that will be in person or online. Things seem to be changing, but the feedback we've gotten from the past few forums has been kind of evenly split. So we may just keep it online, keep it on Zoom if that seems more convenient to people. So always welcome your feedback on that. And I guess not seeing any more hands raised or any more questions in the chat. And just say thanks to everybody and enjoy your evening. And thank you, Dan, for all the great information.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're free to go.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.